Välkomna hit. Roligt att kunna komma. Det här är den första programpunkten under årets Kulturfestivalen Amerikadagarna. Vi ska strax få lyssna till en föreläsning. Jag heter Jan, ordförande i Cassel. Vi har lite andra gäster här också. Vi har Proescholdt family over there. Hi. And we have two exchangees from Fairfield, Iowa, Sarah and Jack. You're also welcome. Så det här är ju programmet. Vi smygstartar lite idag med det här och sen blir det en blueskonsert utanför Café Columbia klockan 7 som man inte vill missa. Och sen är det program imorgon från klockan 1 nere på Kvadratbråken när landshövdingen börjar med att inviga. Och sen blir det program hela eftermiddagen idag. Och programblad finns med det där om ni inte har fått det. Men nu ska vi få lyssna till Kevin Proescholdt. You're welcome. Min första fråga till er är: behöver jag översätta till svenska eller klarar ni engelska? Är det någon som vill översätta?
Lite grann.
Lite grann? Ja, det blir antingen eller. Det går en gått ur. Ja, om man får lite ställa frågor sen. Ja, men då så. They don't need translation.
Okay.
So the floor is all yours. Welcome.
Thank you.
Introduce yourself.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jan. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm very honored by the invitation to be here and to talk about Peter Cassel and some of his influence beyond New Sweden. As you will see during my talk, I am a descendant of Peter Cassel, and I descend through his eldest son, Carl Johan Cassel, and I'll talk about him and his role as well. But it's wonderful to be here. Many of us have heard about Peter Cassel in the past and know that he emigrated from right here in Kisa in 1845 and founded the first Swedish settlement in Iowa called New Sweden. His role in New Sweden, as well as his letters mailed back to Sweden, helped ignite the desire to emigrate to America, and not only in the Skände district, but across Sweden as well. But his influence on the community of Swede Point, now called Madrid, perhaps is less known, and hopefully my talk today can help shed some of the light on that role as well. So I want to thank everyone and all of the organizations that have organized and sponsored Peter Cassel Day and the America Days, especially Jan Hultman and the Peter Cassel Sällskapet, the Immigrant Museum, thank you Cecilia, the Skände and Ydre Kommuner, and all of the others. I know there are many others that have helped sponsor this. And I also wanted to remember two good friends who helped sponsor the original Peter Cassel Day, Kurt and Margaret Rodin, who became good friends and welcomed Jean and me our very first trip here and became good friends and continued their interest in promoting information about Peter Cassel and the great migration to America. This is a map from an article that I had written earlier that Jan has posted on the Peter Cassel Sällskapet webpage, but it shows some of the dispersal patterns away from New Sweden there in the southeastern corner of Iowa. And today I will in particular be talking about Swede Point or Madrid, which is right in the center of this map, as you can see. This is Carl Johan Cassel and his wife Ulrika Delander. Ulrika was born here in Sweden and immigrated the following year in 1846. Carl Johan was born at Källefors, just north of Kisa here, in 1821 in December, and he grew up at Kvarnstugan at the Fulingsö mill, just outside of Kisa on this side of Kisa. Helped his father Peter with farming, building threshing machines, and operating mills. And in 1845, when he was 23, Carl Johan emigrated with his father to Iowa. He stayed in New Sweden and helped his father open up their first farm, but then moved to Fairfield and started a carpentry partnership with Anders Johan de Lander, who had come the following year. In 1846, Peter Cassel's letter that he had written in February was published in the newspapers here in Sweden when another group of over 40 immigrants from parishes like Ulrika Parish, Kisa Parish, and others close by here decided to also go. And they were, in that letter in 1846, Peter Cassel said he had hoped to move his settlement from southeastern Iowa to central Iowa along the Des Moines River Valley. And that second group in 1846 followed those directions and immigrated, made their way to Iowa and went up the Des Moines River Valley to pretty much exact location where Peter Cassel had written he was going to move his settlement. Unfortunately, he had not been able to move his settlement. There was sickness in the colony, and actually one of Peter Cassel's daughters died in 1846. But the DeLander group that went to central Iowa decided to stay there. There were 4 families that decided to stay there, and they were the nucleus of a settlement originally called Swede Point. Back in Fairfield, Carl Johan Cassel married Ulrika de Lander in 1848, and the following year, Carl Johan and Ulrika moved to Swede Point, where her family had settled. There they had 10 children, back in the days with large families. Their first child died as a baby. He was the first known burial at this old Swedish cemetery near Swede Point called the DeLander Cemetery. But then they had 9 more children. There were four daughters here. They will show up in another photo later. 3 of those daughters lived the rest of their lives in Swede Point. Another daughter, Ulrika, Christina, who married Andersson from Skåne. Daughter Clara. This outlaw-looking fellow was John Cassel, wearing the gun and the knife. This photo was actually taken in Leadville, Colorado in 1878 or 1879 when he worked in the silver mines in Leadville for a couple of years, but then came back and spent the rest of his life in Swede Point. Another son, Pete DeLander, and his wife Libby. And then the youngest in the family was Carl Winfield Cassel, but everybody called him Charlie. So there were 6 ways that I want to describe how the Cassel family influenced this new Swedish settlement of Swede Point. The first was developing and platting and developing the town of Swede Point. There was another tiny little settlement right on the Des Moines River called Elk Rapids. And for a while in the early 1850s, there was kind of a competition between the two. in 1851, both Swede Point and Elk Rapids were surveyed and platted for lots and town sites. The Swede Point was platted on Anna DeLander's land. She was the mother of Ulrika. Carl Johann's company helped sell the town lots in this little town. And then in Anna DeLander, who owned the land that the town was on, died in 1854, and one of her sons-in-law was this irascible fellow named Charles Gaston, who was he was an American, spoke English, and I think because of his familiarity with the English language, he was appointed the administrator of his estate, or the estate of Anna DeLander. He was not a nice man, and he often had arguments with his Swedish brothers-in-law and their families, and he also had a man from Spain who worked for him in his employment. And this man from Spain spoke about Madrid, the capital of Spain. And when Charles Gaston had the opportunity to file the next survey for the town, he decided to spite both his Swedish relatives and this Spaniard who worked for him, and he changed the name of the town from Swede Point to Madrid. Swede Point was still used occasionally, and the post office remained as Swede Point up until 1883, but then the name really has been Madrid since then. Also, the first frame house then was constructed in Swede Point for Carl Johan and Ulrika in 1862, and this is the house today. It was the first frame house in town. Previous to this house, they'd all been log cabins made out of logs, but this was sawed lumber that was used to make a frame house. The next area was the whole area of mills, how to saw the wood into boards and how to grind the grain into flour. And early on, they had a very primitive hand-operated millstone that was built by Carl Johan Cassel and his brothers-in-law and an older man named Jacob Nelson. Then Elk Rapids down on the Des Moines River built a water-powered grist mill for grinding flour in the early 1850s. And then in 1854, the owners of the mill in Elk Rapids went 300 miles to the Keokuk, Iowa, on the Mississippi River, bought a steam engine and a sawmill, and hauled it back and erected it at Elk Rapids down by the river. Carl Johan Cassel and his DeLander brothers-in-law the following year did the same thing. Went 300 miles to Keokuk, bought the steam engine and a sawmill, and hauled it all the way back to the middle of nowhere where they were living. 2 years later, in 1857, a flood wiped out the grist mill at Elk Rapids, and Elk Rapids started to fade, and Swede Point started to grow more and more. In 1858, Carl Johan Cassel and his brothers-in-law sold the sawmill, but kept the steam engine, and they used the steam engine to power the first steam-powered grist mill north of Des Moines in Iowa. So it was, they had a very steady operation, and people came from miles and miles around to have their grain ground into flour. They sold that after about 10 years and then returned mostly to farming. But then in 1868 or 1870, the sources kind of are not accurate, that old steam engine from Elk Rapids was brought up to Madrid and rebuilt as a grist mill. And C.J. Cassel helped run that off and on for a number of years. The third area I wanted to mention was the Lutheran Church, St. John's Lutheran Church. The church was founded in 1859. Carl Johann Cassel and his family and his Lander brothers-in-law were charter members of the church. In 1868, they built the first church building. They needed more space, and in 1892, they built a second building. And in 1924, they needed yet more space, and they built the current building. The Cassel family have been members of this church from the very beginning and continuing to this day. Carl Johann Cassel actually led the church services at times when there was no pastor, and he served in leadership positions for 40 years. And three of his children were the first three organists of that church. So here's the old first church from 1868. I think way back then, you can see the women are on the left and the men are on the right, and I think they sat that way inside the church as well. But though it's not a very good photo, the Cassel family members, I'm sure, are in that photo. Here's the second church from 1892. And here's the current church, the big brick church building built in 1924 and remodeled and added to yet today. Carl Johann Cassel was also very active in civic affairs, local governmental affairs. At one point in 1850, there was the state capital was being moved from Iowa City, and Swede Point tried to become the location of the new Capitol building, but they lost out to Des Moines. But still in the eastern part of the town of Madrid, yet today there's an area called Capitol Hill they pitched the idea of building the new state capitol in Swede Point. Carl Johann Cassel was also involved with trying to form a new county, of which Swede Point would be the county seat, the head of the county, but that did not work out either. Carl Johann Cassel was elected to the Boone County Board of Supervisors in 1860, and when the town of Madrid was officially incorporated, they elected the first city council, and Carl Johann was elected to the city council, and later his son Pete Cassel was also served on the city council. The son Peter Cassel was also a businessman. He owned and operated a drugstore, helped start the bank in town, and that's Pete Cassel. The fifth area I wanted to talk about was farming. Of course, many Swedish immigrants hoped to farm in America where land was cheap, or after 1862 and the Homestead Act, essentially free in places where public land still remained. But Carl Johann and his son Charlie farmed. Their oldest daughter, Anna Matilda Cassel, and her husband farmed. Ulrika Christina Cassel and her husband farmed. John Cassel and his wife farmed. And Johanna Cassel Johnson and her husband farmed. Of course, all of this back in those days was done by horses, no tractors, no cars. I liked this photo. This is Bill Cassel, a grandson of Carl Johann Cassel, with his horse and rig. And then this was around 1900, the Charlie Oakleaf. His original Swedish name was Eklöf, but in America they called him Oak Leaf. And those are those same four sisters in the center out at the Oak Leaf farm about 1900. And that's Charlie on the far left. And of course, then also the grandchildren of Carl Johan and Ulrika remained in the area, and they farmed as well, including a granddaughter, Eleonora Cassel, and her husband, Art Czech. And this is their barn today.
Excuse me.
Yes?
Your microphone died. You probably have to get a new battery.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay.
It's not working?
Apparently the battery may have died. It stopped working.
Do you want to use the mic instead?
Oh, sure.
Do this.
Great.
I can take
Tack så mycket.
Shall I take this one?
Okay. There we go. Let's see. Up.
Good.
Thank you. So, okay. And this is a photo of how farming was done. This was in 1905, and that was the young boy in the back of the wagon was my grandfather, age 14. Farming with horses, very, very hard work back then, as many of you know. The last area I wanted to talk about was how the Cassel family influenced Swede Point and Madrid was Swedish American culture. By 1900, most of the early Swedish pioneers had died. Carl Johan Cassel was one of the last. He died in 1902. But the Cassel family influence on Swedish American culture continued really until this day. This was Carl Johan Cassel in his later years. When Carl Johan died, the family came together, and these were all of his grandchildren, or his granddaughters, that came for a photo. My grandmother, Eleonora Cassel, is in kind of the center, one of those three small girls. Her older sister, Lily Cassel, is in the back right of this photo. And they continued to, many of these granddaughters continued in the area, to live in the area, and helped influence the community's development. The Swedish language persisted in some ways for many years. St. John's Lutheran Church held what they called the Swede School in the summer, where the young people of the church would essentially go to summer school to learn and practice Swedish, even though, of course, English was the language most of them used. At the church, the first 5 pastors were all born in Sweden, and of course they used Swedish in the church services up until shortly after the start of the 1900s. And then they started one Sunday evening a month, they would use English. In 1914, 40% of the adult members of the church had been born in Sweden, so there was still a desire for the Swedish language to continue at St. John's Lutheran in Madrid. By 1921, though, the first annual report was written in English, and by 1925, all of the regular services were held in English. But still, into the 1960s, the juli church services at Christmas time were still held in Swedish, the entire service, songs and liturgy alike. And My family to this day still sings one of the songs in Swedish when we gather for Christmas. Right, Carly?
Which one?
Hosianna. So there were other ways that the Swedish culture was perpetuated there too. This was a group of women from the church, I believe, in 1909 at the 50th anniversary of the church. And they were attempting to portray their Swedish heritage. My grandmother is second from the left in the front row, Eleonora, and her eldest sister, Lily Cassel, is on the front row on the far right. There were other ways that the Swedishness was also perpetuated in Madrid. Even into the late 1930s and the early 1940s, Madrid held a midsummer festival every year. It kind of stopped when World War II started, but in 1939, a great granddaughter of Carl Johan Cassel was elected as the Midsummer Queen, and that is my mother. So the Cassel family continues to influence Madrid today, and Peter Cassel's influence continues, not only from the starting of the settlement in 1846, when he directed the Delander group to go to what's now Swede Point, even though he was unable to move his settlement himself. But then when Carl Johan Cassel arrived in 1849 and on to the present day, the Lutheran Church still helps perpetuate some of the Swedish influences. The Madrid Historical Society helps document the Swedish presence in Madrid today. My uncle Earl Czech, who Anders remembers, helps do that work with the Madrid Museum and the Madrid Historical Society. For example, they established this tiny park in downtown Madrid called Castle Corner Park that is sort of a remembrance of the influence of the Cassel family. And this is my uncle Earl Czech earlier this spring, who is still remembers many of the early Cassel family members and the role of Swedish culture in the community, and is so excited that we are here today, being part of Peter Cassel Day. And this is Madrid today, a modern city. It's about 2,400 inhabitants today. Many people of many ethnicities live there now, but it still is known as an early Swedish community, and the role of the Cassel family continues really to this day. And with that, tack så mycket.
Thank you, Kevin. Time for questions if you have any.
Is this information documented online somewhere?
Is this document online somewhere? We are recording this, so it will be on the Peter Cassel website.
Yeah.
But like otherwise, written somewhere?
Is it written down somewhere?
No, not yet. You have heard it for the very first time today.
Yes, any other questions? Don't be shy. I have a question.
Yes.
Why did New Sweden die out? Why did everybody move away from New Sweden?
New Sweden was never, I think, established as a town. It was always a rural community that had, at one point, 3 different churches within about a half a mile of each other. One was Baptist, one was Lutheran, excuse me, and one was Methodist. The Lutheran church and the Methodist church are still there, but it was never envisioned or laid out as a town site. And I think just over time, it had been known in the early days as a point where the Swedish immigrants wanted to go to. You know, many people talked about going to find Cassel. Peter Cassel's youngest daughter remembers when she was young, their attic was full of trunks from the Swedish immigrants who would come to New Sweden and then move out onto the farms nearby to earn money. And the Cassel family would keep their trunks for them until they had earned enough money to buy their own farm or to move on. And I think in many parts of Iowa, rural communities have lost population, and I think New Sweden really was no different. The churches were never enough on their own to retain a big population. So there's a small, tiny town of Lockridge close by, but Lockridge is pretty tiny, right? It's not a whole lot there.
And Swedesburg.
Yes, and Swedesburg is nearby, and Swedesburg is a town of its own. And Swedesburg has a nice museum, a Swedish museum, and helps perpetuate kind of the memory of New Sweden as well. So they do a very nice job.
I have another question.
Yes.
So you talk about New Sweden. Wasn't there also a New Sweden near the coast, which was more like a merchant town?
Yes, there was an early Swedish colony called New Sweden that actually started in the 1600s that included places along the Delaware River and what's now Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and that colony for some years was maintained. Sweden would send Lutheran pastors to that colonial New Sweden, but over the years it sort of faded away. There are other states have towns or communities called New Sweden as well. There's one in the state of Maine. There's one, I believe, in Minnesota. So I think it was common for Swedish immigrants to name their settlements New Sweden to remind them of their home and their culture.
And Fairfield, did people also move to Fairfield?
Yes. Yes, there were Swedish people who lived in Fairfield, and I don't believe they ever made up a large segment of the population because it became, a nice city. But there were Swedish immigrants who came and lived in Fairfield itself. So, right?
Okay, any questions?
I think I have a question. I think you can hear me. As an architect, I'm curious about the houses they build. Is it has the Swedish architecture in a way, of the Swedish way of building houses, have any impact on the house you see today?
That's a good question. I don't know if I know the answer. Almost all of the earliest Swedish buildings no longer exist. We are not nearly as good in America as you are here in Sweden of keeping and preserving the older buildings. I don't know about the architectural influence of the Swedes in the early buildings.
But the red colors in the barns,
Yeah.
that still remains to the day, to this day. It's very familiar to come here and see that color in all the buildings because all the barns in that area, not all of them, but many of them, including our family farm.
Is that typical of that area or the whole? It's just in that part of
It's
United States there are red barns?
It's common, but it's kind of a unique red. That what you call it?
Falloon red?
Yes. Yes. Versus like a more bright red. I'm not an expert, but that when I think of any kind of architecture, I feel a strong connection between the red, that Swedish red building here, and some of the old barns and buildings in that area of Sweden, Iowa.
Thank you.
Was that right?
Anyone else?
One more question.
Okay.
You have many lovely photos of people, and I think I suppose you have done a big job to collect all the photos, or maybe your uncle check. But someone must have taken the photos, but these very early photos. Was there a photographer in Sweden?
There was at least one photographer in Swede Point, and many of the old family photos were taken by that photographer. Some of the earliest ones were, we sometimes call them tin types, daguerre type, that were printed on metal. And that one of Carl Johan Cassel, that was a daguerre type photo that was then somebody had painted his beard on. And I don't know where those were taken. But yeah. Yes, and my grandmother and grandfather collected family photos, and now my Uncle Earl Check has them, and he let me scan many of them. So.
Yes. No more, Cecilia? No. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming all this way and giving us this interesting information.
Oh, thank you.
Another round of applause. Så program för resten